organization with a mission to create and sustain a network to promote and publicize research and education relevant to First Ladies. Our vision, FLAIR, will be the primary association to encourage interdisciplinary collaboration and outreach among scholars, institutions, First Lady staff, biographers, archivists, journalists, and public historians interested in research and education about the lasting legacy of U.S. First Ladies. I am pleased tonight to welcome Libby McNamee. Libby is a native of Boston who now lives in Richmond, Virginia. She is a lawyer, speaker, and award-winning author of 2 upper middle grade novels, Susanna's Midnight Ride, The Girl Who Won the Revolutionary War, and Dolley Madison and the War of 1812, America's First Lady, and their study guides. She is also the co-editor of the Epic Story of 1776 and the Epic Story of America, 1777 to 1779. Currently, she is writing a 3rd novel, The Union Spy Mistress, Elizabeth Van Lew. Tonight's talk is entitled Dolley Madison and the War of 1812. FLAIR is pleased to welcome Libby McNamee.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate it. And thank you very much to FLAIR for having me tonight. And I am honored to speak about my favorite First Lady tonight. Now, who knows of Dolley Madison being a wonderful hostess, right? I can raise my hand. We all know that. We all know that she was a wonderful hostess. But who out there knows that she was also a social genius of her time? And that's something I didn't know until I actually went to a lecture on Dolley Madison given by the CEO of Montpelier. And that set me off on researching and really falling in love with her story and writing Dolley Madison and the War of 1812. Let's see. So we could move on to the slides. That's great. Here we are. Here's the cover. And we can move to the next slide, please. And here is Dolley Payne. Dolley, you'll find Dolley. It's Dolley Payne Todd Madison. She grew up in Scotchtown, Virginia. She came from a devout Quaker family, and she was only 13 years old when the Battle of Yorktown took place. And at that point, her father freed their slaves, and they moved to Philadelphia, this city of brotherly love. Have very heavy Quaker population, and he opened a starch business. And I remember when I first started researching it, I thought that doesn't sound very lucrative, and it wasn't. And he went bankrupt very quickly, and he was so depressed about that he went to bed and basically never got out of bed again, and died a couple of years later of depression. And he was cast out of the Quaker church, the Society of Friends, because they considered that a sign of disapproval from God of hitting bankruptcy. So on his deathbed, he asked his daughter Dolley to marry John Todd, a young upcoming Quaker lawyer. And she obliged him, and they were very happy together. They had 2 small boys, and then the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 hit, and she lost her husband and her newborn son on the same day. And her older son, it was a toddler, survived. She and Dolley and her son Payne both had yellow fever, but they survived. And at that point, she ended up moving in with her mother. Her mother was running a boarding house in Philadelphia because at that point it was the temporary capital of the United States while Washington City was being built. So she moved in with her mother and helped her run the boarding house. And she very quickly became the most sought after young widow in Philadelphia. And she was gregarious, she was beautiful, she was tall, just very chatty, very kind. And she had a line of suitors outside the door. And one of the boarders in her mother's boarding house happened to be Aaron Burr. And James Madison happened to spot Dolley Payne Todd on the street and asked Aaron Burr to introduce them. And the rest, as they say, is history. The 2 met, and within several months, they were married. And next slide, please. Now, this is a very short resume for James Madison. His resume could go on for 10 pages. But at the time that Dolley Madison, at age 25, met James Madison, he was 42 years old. He was a bachelor, and he was a very well-established and well-respected founding father. He, as we see the first couple of bullet points here, he wrote the Virginia Plan. He was the father of the Constitution. He was also the architect of the Bill of Rights. He was the leader of the first House of Representatives. He beat James Monroe for that slot, and that's why he lived in Philadelphia. So that's who he is when he comes onto the scene with Dolley. So when you look at that, you really think, gosh, they were very opposite. They were opposite personality-wise. They were opposite in education. He had gone to College of New Jersey, now called Princeton University. He spoke 6 languages. He came from a very wealthy family, and basically had all the pedigree, really, that Dolley did not. And he was also a very small man. He was about 100 pounds soaking wet and sickly. So he never held a musket during the revolution, but he proved himself much more powerful with a pen, and doing all the writing and doing all the big thinking that he was so famous for. So when they got married, they really became a very tight couple. And Dolley said, our hearts understand each other. And they were both very humble people and very kind people. And that's something I believe that really brought them together as a couple. And so since Dolley married Madison, who was not a Quaker, she was cast out of the church. And I like to believe that I think she was quite happy about that, because she always enjoyed fashion. She didn't like wearing the plain gray garb and the lack of jewelry. And she very quickly built her wardrobe and became known for dressing quite fashionably and very avant-garde for the time. And she actually even would get they were called fashion dolls. She would get fashion dolls mailed to her from Paris of the latest fashion. And she would give it to her seamstress and say, will you please make me this dress in my size? So she was always on the cutting edge of the fashion and setting new fashion in America. So what I like to say is that her superpower was kindness. And a lot of that, I believe, comes from her Quaker upbringing. They believe that everyone has an inner light. And that is something that really became such a valuable tool throughout her career, as well as her husband's. So the next slide, please. So I loved the CEO of Montpelier called them Washington's first power couple. I just love that idea, because when you look at how opposite they were, it would have been easy for them to be critical of one another, but they really drew on each other's strengths, were very proud of each other's strengths, and became a real force to be reckoned with. So Charles Pinckney, who ran against Madison during his first term for the presidency, said, I lost to Mr. and Mrs. Madison. I would have stood a better chance had I run against Mr. Madison alone. So I love that quote, because Dolley already was so popular because Madison had served as Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State for 2 terms. So she did a lot of socializing at the White House, because Jefferson was a widower at that point, and she had a lot of entertaining going on at their home as well. And so when Madison was sworn in, people called her the Presidentess, and they were so excited to see her. There was almost like a mad stampede to see her wherever she was. And she was always very, very kind to everyone, no matter what their status was. So next slide, please. So this is early Washington City, long before the Beltway was ever a thought in anyone's imagination. So you see from the president's house, you can see all the way down to the Potomac River, and there's nothing there. And there really was nothing there, because there was a compromise, in the room where it happened up in New York, establishing Washington City as our new capital, but the city had to be built. So at the time when Dolley and Mr. Madison moved to Washington City when he was Secretary of State, there was nothing there. Their address was 6 buildings. So if you wanted to write them a letter, you could write to Dolley and James Madison and say 6 buildings, Washington City, and it would get to them, because it was the one place where there were 6 buildings together. So it's just mind-boggling. So they called it their streets streets with no buildings and buildings with no streets. So you had New York Avenue, you had Pennsylvania Avenue, but there was nothing on it. There were no buildings there. So they had like kilns and, brickyards going on, but it was definitely very much a city under construction. And she did confide to a friend in one letter, "I wish I was still in Philadelphia," but she just kept on keeping on, as she was known to do, of promoting Washington City and trying to make Washington City into the national capital that it is today. So next slide, please. Now, this is the Capitol, which looks very familiar, but as you can see, it's missing something very important, the dome. And we couldn't afford a dome at this point. That's how broke we were. We had very little money in our treasury. We were a brand new country. George Washington was sworn in 1789, and James Madison was sworn in 20 years later. So for a way for us to gain perspective, if you think about the fact that that would be as if our country started when George W. Bush was president. So that's how young our country was. So we had our country in a lot of ways, but we really didn't know what we wanted to do with it. And so here we are with the unfinished Capitol. And of course, House is on one side, Senate's on the other, and there's wooden boards that connect the two sides. And but what in addition to connecting the two sides of the unfinished building, that also served as the restroom for the members of Congress out there in the mud. So that shows you really what a state we were in, and what a basic level that we were at as a country in establishing this national capital. And at that point, America was very divided into regional groups. So up in the New England area, you had the Federalist Party, and they were for a bigger government and more national control, a national bank, a standing army. And they were also called the Doves. They did not want to go to war at all. And then the other dominant party was the Democratic Republicans, and that was spearheaded by Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison, and they were called Republicans, which has no affiliation to today. But they were all in favor of a decentralized society of government, and Jefferson especially envisioned America as agrarian farmers and didn't really have the vision of these big cities and the financial centers that we have today. And so there was a huge difference of opinion, and in addition to the regional factors. So basically the Southerners were Democratic Republicans and the Westerners, and then the Northeasterners were the Federalists. And basically a lot of the problem between the two sides had to do with impressment. And at this point, Great Britain was fighting Napoleon, and they needed more sailors to help them out in this fight that was going on and on for over a decade. So they started to, quote unquote, impress our Navy sailors and even our merchant marines and businessmen on the high seas. And this went on for all of Jefferson's presidency. And as Secretary of State, that was Madison's job to try to resolve that. And it never did get resolved. And Jefferson was very relieved when he left the presidency and was able to pass the baton to Madison. He called the presidency a splendid misery, and I wish my friend the very best. And he never came back to Washington City. So what Jefferson and Madison came up with is they decided to have an embargo on British goods. However, that hurt the Federalists up in New England because that was the shipbuilding industry. So the Federalists, I think, were justifiably very angry because they said, well, you're doing this. It doesn't affect you. You're an agrarian farmer, but you're destroying our livelihood. So the atmosphere was very charged, very heated, very, very divided. So next slide, please. And here we have the president's house. This is the president's house from the front side. So if you look, there's no gate, there is no steps, there is no lawn, there's really, it's just there. And in a lot of ways, it really wasn't even completed. And when Dolley and James moved in there basically was very little furniture in there. Mr. and Mrs. Adams had only lived in there for 4 months before he left office. And when Mr. Jefferson came into power, he brought his own beautiful furniture from Monticello. And when he left the presidency, he took his furniture with him. So when they first toured the president's house, Dolley was horrified at the state of the president's house, and really saw that America had an identity crisis. We knew we didn't want to be a monarchy, but she believed that we needed some grandeur. We needed some beautiful things to inspire us and to unite us. And however, there was one beautiful thing that was in the president's house when they moved in. So that's the next slide, please. And this is a life-size portrait of General Washington by Gilbert Stuart, who was the leading painter of the time. So this huge portrait had a huge, as you can see, gilded frame around it, very heavy. So it had to be bolted to the wall in the state dining room. And that was something that Dolley and James had one of their rare squabbles over, that he wanted it to be in the dining room, and she wanted to have it in what was called the Oval Saloon. And but this was one of the few things that he insisted on, and that's where it was hung, there in the dining room. And so Dolley was so frustrated with the state of the president's house that she called in Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, John Calhoun, and they were called the War Hawks. And they were the part of the Republican Party who were really jonesing to go to war. They really wanted to take on Great Britain and establish ourselves, and were tired of being disrespected by them. So she invited them over and basically shamed them with the state of the house, and basically said, the British have Buckingham Palace and the French have Versailles, and we have this. And no wonder why they bat us around like a cat with a dead mouse, and they have no respect for us. So they were saying, well, we've got this war to pay for. But she managed to persuade them, and they gave her $5,000, and she decorated the 3 front rooms and came in under budget. So kudos to her for coming in under budget of redecorating and renovating these 3 front rooms for the public to use. So next slide, please. So this is what the Oval Saloon looked like when after Dolley had made all her changes with her decorator, and they called this her charm offensive. And she originally called them Mrs. Madison's Wednesday nights, and she put an ad in the paper and advertised these Wednesday night get-togethers from 3 to 5, and said that everyone was welcome. So this was just mind-blowing, the fact that everyone was invited, that Henry Clay was invited, but also his coachman. Everyone was invited. Even the women were invited, which was very, very rare. So at first, the Federalists didn't want to go. They hated Madison. They wanted nothing to do with it. But basically, since there was nothing in Washington City, these congressmen and senators had nowhere to live. They had nowhere to bring their families. They all lived in these boarding houses right across from the Capitol. And basically, they just fought, and they had a roommate, and they would fight with their roommate about politics. So finally they realized, well, we don't have anything else to do. There's nowhere else to go. And I hear there's going to be really good food, and I hear she's decorated, and it's going to be a beautiful place. So before you know it, everyone turns out, and week after week, more and more people turn out, more and more people squeeze in. And so they become known as squeezes. And there was no need to have an ad in the newspaper anymore, because anybody who could get there was going there. And all she asked was that you wore the nicest clothes that you had. So she didn't restrict anyone based, if they were a laborer or anything like that. Everyone was welcome. And that was part of it, is she wanted the president's house to be everyone's house. She wanted everyone to feel like it belongs to them. And it doesn't just belong to the upper crust. And once again, trying to break away from that monarchical feeling. And so really, really amazing. And what she would do is she would walk around and survey the crowd. And if she saw that people weren't getting along, she would send them some cake, or she'd send them some punch, or she'd go and inquire about their grandchildren and ask about their family and how they were doing. And it was really masterful at what a welcoming person she was. But really, this was part of where her social genius comes in. Is the real reason she was having these was to help her husband's agenda, that he was having trouble getting things through because there was so much animosity. And she thought that if I can get all these people together and I can get them to just chat and eat cake and drink punch and talk about the weather and get to know each other's people, then they can actually have that as a platform and build on that and actually have a conversation and come to some resolution on all of these policy issues that people are diametrically opposed to each other. So she would ask her husband, Mr. Introvert, who would you like to speak with tonight? And he would say, well, I'd like Henry Clay. I'd like Daniel Webster. And she would say, okay. And she would bring them over because she was so popular, and she started wearing these turbans on her head that would match her dress, with the same fabric or decoration. And because people would just flock to her. And poor Mr. Madison would get pushed off into the corner, but he was perfectly happy in the corner. He had one black suit. It was still revolutionary style. And he was fine being off in the corner, but she would bring people to him and she would escort them over, and they would accomplish so much that Madison, who really didn't want to have these squeezes to begin with, was thrilled by the end of the night of saying, I got more work done tonight than I would a week at my desk. So she was very effective. And Henry Clay said to her at one of these events, everyone loves Mrs. Madison. And she said, and that's because Mrs. Madison loves everyone. And that was her magic, is really making everyone feel welcome and very genuine. She genuinely enjoyed people. And when people left, she would say, I'm so sorry you're leaving. I'm so sorry you have to go so soon. Because as I said, these were supposed to go from 3 to 5 in the afternoon, and they often went to midnight and beyond. So I am sure Mr. Madison was very worn out by the end of these evenings. But it was extremely effective in creating an American identity and creating a sense of camaraderie among the people who were in Washington City. So next slide, please. So these are some of Dolley's favorite props, and these are just examples of how gracious she was. So at that time, Pride and Prejudice was a very popular novel, and Don Quixote was another very popular novel. So she would walk around with a copy of the book, and she would say to people, oh, have you read Pride and Prejudice? And the person said, no. I mean, some of these people couldn't read. If they said no, she'd say, oh, I haven't either. I've heard it's very good, but I just haven't had the time. So then if she ran into someone and said, oh, have you read Don Quixote? And they said, oh, yes, it was amazing. She'd say, oh, it was amazing, because she had read the books. But she tried to meet people where they were and tried to make them feel comfortable. And she also had this parrot named Polly. And when I give talks in person, I love to bring Polly out. There you go. But Polly was a character. And so she was a great icebreaker for people, because people were just really just tongue-tied when they saw her. They just loved her and heard so much about her. They were just frozen. So she was trying to really help people feel comfortable around her and put them at ease. So one of my favorite stories about her is she had one of these gatherings, and she recognized this young man, and he was, a lumber worker in what's called greasy boots. And she noticed him off in the corner by himself, just leaning against the wall, feeling uncomfortable. And she thought, I don't want to go over there and make him more nervous. But when she noticed one of her servants bringing him coffee, and he came forward to get one, she thought, oh, well, I'll go greet him. So he got so flustered, he dropped the coffee cup on the floor, and he took the saucer and he shoved it into his pocket. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry. I jostled you. This crowd is so great. And I do believe I've met your mother some years ago. And he said, oh, yes, you did. My mother just still talks about meeting you, and, how much, she loves you. And So she immediately puts this young man at ease and enjoys, and then he enjoys the rest of the evening immensely. So just an inkling of Dolly and how she was kind to everyone, no matter what their station was. And the next slide, please. Now, Mr. Madison tried everything he could do as president to avoid war. And, he was a very, very thorough person, incredibly thorough. And he felt like he had done everything he could do. And he finally went into Congress to declare war. And every Federalist voted against it. And some of the Republicans abstained. And this was the first time that America had declared war on another country as an established nation. So it passed by the narrowest margin in history that we've ever had in declaring war. So he declares war, and it doesn't go very well. There are some, shining moments in there, and particularly in the Navy. And but there's a whole lot of disasters of trying to invade Canada, and it for the most part is really a miserable experience for Madison. And the country, of course, was so divided on going to war that once war was declared, the New England states went into mourning. They closed their schools, they shuttered their stores, they dressed in black, they tolled funeral bells. Meanwhile, down south and out west, they were whooping it up. They were having parades. They were, out there with their flags. There were firecrackers. There's celebrations. So that's just how deep the divide absolutely was. And Dolly, of course, is torn apart. That the country is so divided, and hearing comments about her husband, even in their home while having the Wednesday nights of overhearing nasty comments about her husband. And she did what she always does. She kept on being kind, and she would call on people, particularly the wives of the Doves, of the Federalists, and she would invite them over. And once again, they would have lovely food in her parlor. And then she would eventually get around to talking about her husband and what his positions were and why he believed that that was the right course of action. And that was all in the hopes that these women would go home and talk to their husbands and convince them to come around to Madison's point of view. So she knew exactly what she was doing, and she was very limited in her time as with the rights of women back then. But she worked within that tiny little purview so effectively that most people didn't even realize what she was doing. So really, really remarkable woman. And she also would go to Congress and watch all the debates. And part of it was she knew people would behave better if there were women there. But she also loved the politics, and she loved that was absolutely her favorite thing to do in Washington City, was to go and attend all of these debates and go to Congress. So next slide, please. Now, going very quickly through the military part of it, is eventually, as we're going through the War of 1812, that Napoleon is defeated by the British. And at that point, it's a wonderful thing for the world, but that also means that the full might of the Great Britain is going to be thrust upon us. And here they come. That's where the British soldiers come directly from defeating Napoleon, and they are headed for America. And unfortunately, poor Madison, another one of his many worries is he didn't have many great choices for his cabinet. And he ended up with Secretary Armstrong as his Secretary of War, who was absolutely terrible. He was arrogant. He undermined him. He contradicted him. And he, people knowing that the British were headed to the shore, he said, "Oh, they're just going to go to Baltimore. It's the third largest city. They're not going to come to Washington City. There's nothing here. There's no reason." And he was obstinate about that. Well, the British landed in Maryland, and became very quickly apparent that they were headed for Washington City. And they, Madison called out militia in Virginia and Maryland, tried to call them up, these untrained people, and calls them up and goes out to meet the British just over the line in Bladensburg, Maryland. And he is also deluded. He thinks that it's going to be a rout and they're going to push them back. And he tells Dolley, "We'll have dinner for 40 waiting for me, and I'll have all the generals here. We will celebrate our victory." And he heads off on his white horse. He is almost caught at the Battle of Bladensburg, very, very close to getting caught. And then the Battle of Bladensburg took place. And all of a sudden, and it was, of course, it was August 24th, 1814. It was like 110 degrees. All these people are wearing wool. They don't have enough water. People are dying of heat stroke. But they start the battle, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there are these flaming rockets in the sky, just flying at our American militiamen. And they are just absolutely horrified. They had no idea what was going on. They had never heard of it, anything like this. They had never seen anything. They were not prepared. So they did what any other God-fearing human would do, is they turned around and ran. And there was no plan for regrouping if something like this happened. And they just all basically skedaddled back into Washington City, coming in from all different directions. Total disaster. So they called it the British called it the Bladensburg races, in that tiny little James Madison was the jockey on the horse in this horse race, basically to get out of there, seeing who could get out of there the fastest. So Dolley is back in Washington City, and she has no idea what's going on. And she's told her husband that she will wait for him. And she has the gift of perception. She knows it doesn't look good if the president's wife is seen fleeing the city. So at this point, the women and children are they've thrown their feather bed in their wagon, and they're just trying to get across the bridge to Virginia. And then there's all these shell-shocked soldiers just pouring from all different directions, and it's total mayhem. So the mayor of Washington City comes and asks her several times, Mrs. Madison, you need to leave. He didn't want it on his conscience that she was caught by the British. And she said, well, I promised my husband that I'd wait for him. And then finally, there was a free black man who came in, and he was waving his arms on his horse, and he came up to the president's house, and he waved to Dolley, and he said, clear out, clear out. And she said, I promised my husband that I'd wait. And he said, your husband's the one who sent me. Like, you need to go. So he had sent a message a little bit earlier, like, well, things aren't so good. Can you gather up, my important documents from the Constitutional Convention? And so she was, pretty much all ready to go and ready to clear out. It kind of does just another sweep through the president's house, and she sees the portrait of George Washington. So the next slide, please. And she realizes, I can't leave this. What will this represent if the British get this and they have this in their hands and they are parading it through the streets of London? It'll decimate American morale, and this can't happen. So meanwhile, Madison had set up if everything goes south type of thing with his friend, Mr. Carroll, who owned this mansion over in Georgetown called Bellevue, now called Dumbarton. And I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. But he had said to Mr. Carroll, if things really, go badly, will you come pick up Dolley and bring her to your house, and I will meet you there. And then we'll go over the bridge into Virginia together. So Mr. Carroll comes to pick her up, and she's like, I'm not going anywhere. I've got to save this portrait. I can't leave the portrait of George Washington there. So there's a really neat quote about how he became quite ill-tempered with Dolley because she was insisting on staying. And they ended up having to break the frame on the picture and got it out. And then they've got this 8x10 picture that needs to stay flat. And all of a sudden, first of several miracles that take place in the next few days is these men from New York, friends of theirs, come and say, can we help you with anything? And she says, yes, here you go. Take care of this portrait and don't roll it up because you'll crack it. So he hands it off to them, and then she heads to Bellevue to wait for her husband. So next slide, please. Here she is. It is done. The precious portrait placed in the hands of the gentleman for safekeeping. So next slide, please. And this is Bellevue, which is now Dumbarton House in Georgetown. So they waited for Madison, and he didn't show up, and eventually sent a messenger and said he could not get through the crowds because it was just full of all these fleeing soldiers. So he said, I will find you in Virginia. So next slide, please. So she heads across the river. She's here in red, and she goes across the river here, and she stops at I believe it's Salona there. And then she makes her way down to Wiley Tavern down there at the bottom. So Madison goes back to the president's house to make sure to see if she's still there, and she's gone. So he goes, but he can't make his way to go over the same bridge she did. He had to go over it. So he's here in yellow. So he went all the way down, all the way over, and basically searching for her. And he was basically on horseback. At this point, he was about 65 years old, and he's on horseback, this sickly man, for basically 48 hours straight. So they find each other here at Wiley Tavern. And in the meantime, there had been this just incredible storm, probably the worst storm that Washington City has ever had to this day. Just kind of tornado, hurricane that was tearing the roofs off of homes. It was, people had to hang on to something or they'd be blown over. And so this all happens. And next slide, please. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. That happens a little bit later. just a few hours later, but the British come in, they come down Maryland Avenue, go to the Capitol, and they go inside and they take an aye nay vote on, should we burn the Capitol down or not? And of course, it's unanimously an aye vote. So they set the Capitol on fire, and it's this huge ball on the horizon. So people could see it as far away as Baltimore, into Virginia. And it also contained the Library of Congress and the Supreme Court at that time. So next slide, please. And then they went to the State Department, Treasury. Then they came to the president's house, and they went inside to snoop around, and they noticed it was dinner for 40. So they sat down and had a lovely meal and toasted to Jemmy. And while the General Coburn snooped around upstairs in all their personal effects. But when they left when they finished their meal, they broke all the windows in the president's house, went outside, and each soldier had a stick and lit with a rag doused in oil, and they set them aflame at the same time and threw them through the windows of the president's house. So it basically just it was like a big fireball explosion, and absolutely just horrifying. And people, Dolley could see it from where she was, and out in Virginia. And once again, people could see it all from Baltimore, and people were absolutely horrified. So the next slide, please. And what happened next really is that's when the storm hit. It hit Northern Virginia. It also hit Washington City, and it actually helped put out a lot of the fires, and which was an absolute blessing. And the General Coburn, who was in charge, even asked an American woman on the street, "Do you have storms like this often?" And she said, "Only when the enemy comes to town." So Dolley waits for word from Madison, and he says, when they have left. And basically the next day, the British went to the Navy Yard, and there had been a couple of warships that were about to be launched, and Madison sent orders to have them destroyed. But they went, of course, just to see what they could find. And one of the soldiers just threw a match, lit a cigarette, and he threw a match into a well. Well, it turns out the Americans had filled the well with ammunition, and that was just this absolutely gruesome, fearsome explosion. And at that point, the British were like, "We are getting out of this crazy city," and they left. And then Dolley got a note from Madison that it was safe to go back to town, but to dress as a countrywoman. So she came, and she went straight to the president's house, to this smoking corpse. And she said, right on the steps in front of everyone who was gathered, "The enemy shall not frighten a free people." And the newspaper was back in print the next day, and they had her as the headline, "The spirit of a nation is roused." And this is a time when women were not mentioned in the newspaper at all, and she was the headline. So absolutely amazing. And it was very daring of her to come back, because they didn't know if the British were going to come back or not. They had no idea what they were going to do. So next slide, please. So they are homeless, and they end up moving into the Octagon House, which is just down the street on the corner of New York Avenue. And this is a great sign. It's 1814. Do you know where your president is? So they move in there. They end up renting the house, and Dolley does what she always does. She starts entertaining. I mean, the woman didn't have anything but the clothes on her back, and no furnishings, no nothing. And she immediately starts entertaining because people were saying, why are we going to rebuild Washington City? We never should have started in the first place. Let's just move the capital back to New York. Let's put it in Philadelphia again. Let's put it in Cincinnati. So she just wanted to create this momentum to keep the capital there. And they thought she and Madison believed that it was a sign of weakness, and that it would look as if the British had chased us out, and we couldn't allow that to happen. So, but it becomes very clear that the Secretary of War Armstrong was correct about, as they say, he was 50% correct, because they did attack Washington City where he was wrong, but then they decided that they would attack Baltimore. So that is really just such an amazing story. So next slide, please. So people start pouring in from the New England states, the Federalist states, from all over, people of all ages, sizes, men, women, and they start building fortifications and trying to protect Baltimore. And it was just this common outrage that the British had come and burned Washington City, that it really drew people together, even the people who had been very much against the war. So Francis Scott Key was actually a distant cousin of Dolley's, and he was sent as an emissary to get an American out of the British were keeping in jail there on a ship. And as he arrived there, they said, sure, you can have the prisoner, but we're not going to let you leave until after this battle is over. And that's why he was sitting there on this British ship, and he had this view of the battle, and wrote the Star-Spangled Banner that immediately became a sensation. And but he was a Federalist. At the beginning of the war, he called the war a lump of wickedness. So this just goes to show how much the, just the national sentiment changed overnight, where all of a sudden everyone was behind the war and everyone had pulled together as one. So it's really an amazing moment. And once again, during the bombardment, a horrible storm kicks in, and that's why people couldn't tell what was going on. And it was just in the next morning, when they saw that our flag was still there, that they know that the British basically gave up and left the harbor, and that all of our efforts had paid off and had saved Baltimore. So next slide, please. So you'd think we'd be done by now after repulsing them from Baltimore, but no. Madison gets word from Andrew Jackson down in New Orleans that he believes that the British are headed his way. So, poor Madison, the guy just can't get a break. So at that point, Louisiana was the newest state in the Union, and really no one had been there, because there were no roads that really led there because of all the bayous, and there were a lot of Native Americans in that undeveloped land, and it was very, very dangerous passing through there. And but it was also very dangerous going by boat. So going down around Florida, there were pirates. So basically, Louisiana became a state, and really no one had been there. And the newest state, and the fact that they all spoke French. They didn't even speak English for the most part. So the people Washington City are thinking, are these people really Americans? Are they really going to fight for us? Well, Andrew Jackson declared martial law, took everyone's hunting guns, redistributed them, and brought everyone together: the Creoles, the Cajuns, the French aristocrats, the Spaniards, the free blacks, the privateers, the profiteers. Everyone was brought together, and in this unbelievable battle, in about half an hour, the Andrew Jackson's army just decimated the British, and the British outnumbered them 2-1. It's just absolutely amazing. There were 6 generals killed, and just amazing. Once again, weather plays a huge role, and it's so difficult to get word from Louisiana to begin with. Then there's all this bad weather. So this is on January 8th, 1815, and they have to wait almost a month to find out what happened. So people were saying that Madison was covering it up, that we had lost New Orleans and we had lost Louisiana, but he was covering it up, and da 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 da. And finally, the word gets through about the miracle of New Orleans, and people just go absolutely crazy, and they are just celebrating for days on end, and just the euphoria, women banging on pots and pans in the street, and church bells ringing nonstop. Next slide, please. But 15 days later, so, right as all the excitement is dying down, all of a sudden the emissaries from the committee that was trying to negotiate peace over in Ghent in Belgium, they arrived back and they said, we've got this treaty, and the British have already signed it, and when you look at the date on the treaty, it was signed on December 24th, 1814. So technically there was a treaty in place before the Battle of New Orleans, but for Americans, it really made us feel like we had won the war, and it established us on the world stage as a force to be reckoned with, that the Americans whipped. These are the same soldiers that defeated Napoleon, and that the ragtag army that Andrew Jackson pulled together defeated them. So at that point, of course, everyone loved Dolley to begin with, and they hated Madison after the burning of Washington City, and now all of a sudden everybody loved him, and it ushered in what's called the era of good feelings. And next slide, please. Now, this is in today's White House, and there's the portrait of George Washington in the East Room of the White House, and there's the portrait of Dolley in her parlor. And the pictures aren't able to show this, but this portrait of Dolley looks out over the portrait of George Washington. So whoever put that there, whatever decorator or historian put that there, had a great sense of humor, because Dolley Madison is there to look out and make sure that nobody takes off with the George Washington portrait. So it's a great little touch there. When at the end of Madison's second term, they leave and they go back to Montpelier, and 20 years later, he passes away, and she ends up moving back to Washington City, and her son, Payne, lived up to his name truly, and was quite a spendthrift, and she found herself really basically penniless. But she was given an honorary seat in Congress, and she would go listen to the debates. And if she appeared late, she would ask them to start all over again, and they would. And she was asked to lay the cornerstone of the Washington Monument with Eliza Hamilton. She sent the first telegraph, and every president who was sworn in or who was elected had to go get her permission before they were sworn in. So her house was called the Little White House, right there on Lafayette Square. And she was called the friend of 12 presidents. And when she passed away, her funeral was the largest funeral in the history of our country. They closed the federal government, and President Zachary Taylor was the one who gave her eulogy, who was also a distant cousin. And he coined the term, calling her the first lady of the land. And that's where the term first lady came from, which is really just wonderful. And her legacy afterwards is people love to use her name for all sorts of products, because everybody loved Dolley Madison, as Henry Clay had said, way back when. The next time you have a Twinkie, think of Dolley Madison, because Hostess cupcakes used to be called Dolley Madison cupcakes, and Hostess bought it out. So that was one of the many successful companies that started using Dolley Madison's name. So Chris, do you have any questions? I know I packed a lot in.
I wanted to say thank you, Libby, for a marvelous presentation. It was really lively, and I learned some things. And I actually want to encourage our audience to submit questions in the chat function. But I'm going to start. I actually do have a searing question for you here. I really want to know. I was fortunate enough to be able to beta test for my college classes the textbook that Diana Carlin, Anita McBride, and Nancy Keegan-Smith wrote, U.S. First Ladies. And one of the things that they told me was that they had never learned anything about first ladies in any of their previous history or social studies courses. And I'm wondering, since you write for a younger audience, do you have any sense of how your audience has responded to the history of the First Ladies?
Oh, it's wonderful. I love, especially the girls, of inspiring them, of, just what a role model she was on so many levels. That it's wonderful, because they always say, as an author, write the book that you want to read. And this is the kind of book I would have loved to have had, that I would have loved to have read at that age. So it's really an honor. And I feel like I underestimated her. I thought she was a great hostess, and I really didn't give her much credit. So that's why I love to spread the word of, that's just the tip of the iceberg with Dolley, that she was a wonderful hostess. And she was. But it is, I love opening up the minds of young kids, or anyone of any age. And just the same way my eyes were opened about what Dolley's role was during the War of 1812, of keeping people together. And she was really here at a time that our nation really needed her.
Well, that calls to mind another question. Was she aware at the time she was First Lady about how significant she was to the evolving role of First Lady? I mean, did she have any, do you get a sense that she had a sense that she was part of something bigger in the evolution of history as the First Lady?
Yes, I do think she did that. And that's what one of her gifts was, is her gift for perception, and the way that people perceive her, the way they perceive her husband. Like, she's the one that started the song "Hail to the Chief," because during the War of 1812, people were, little Jemmy, they'd call him, to make fun of him, that he was a small man and he wasn't commanding. So she started to do that. Whenever they had a dinner party, she would have the band play "Hail to the Chief," and she made him have this grand entrance into the room, because she understood that. So I think she really understood what she was doing as far as setting precedents, and that really it was just wide open. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, he would answer the door of the White House himself, and he'd have slippers on with holes in the toe, because he didn't want to come across as monarchical. But she realized, okay, we don't want to come across as a monarchy, but we need something else. And she started wearing pearls instead of jewels and diamonds, because diamonds are more like regal, they're more expensive, they're more, kind of elite. So she's the one that started the phenomenon of women wearing pearls to this day. So I think she had a gift for creating like subliminal messages, and providing like visual cues for people to rally around and take pride in.
Yeah, one of the things that
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things your presentation makes clear is that she really was able to thread the needle between the ceremony of the old world and the more Republican, little r Republican America. So I think she was very good at that. I think she was very effective at that. And I think a lot of First Ladies, beyond her, tried to emulate that a great deal.
Yes, I know. When I think about Elizabeth Monroe following in her footsteps, she would be a very tough act to follow.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm also, there's a question, how did she react to the criticism of her husband leveled by the Federalists? You explained very well what she said publicly and what she did publicly, but was there any private moment where she, really got angry or, boiled over about how they were treating James Madison?
I think so. I think that she was very frustrated with them, but she really just always kind of kept her composure, and that's what was just amazing. Is she? I'm sure she had choice words in private for them and the way they treated him, because she loved him dearly, and knew how unfair it was, how he was being treated and maligned. So I'm sure she did, but I do think it goes back to her Quaker upbringing of like, she always took the high road and, offered the other cheek to people, even people who were insulting her husband right in her own home. And she would just be incredibly gracious. And eventually they'd come around and become her friend, because she didn't give up. She would just keep calling on people and keep, charming them. And so we can all learn something from Dolley Madison. Having kindness as a superpower.
Yeah, and she also exhibited a lot of grace under pressure. I'm wondering, how close did she come to being captured by the British? I mean, did she make it out just in the nick of time? Or, I mean, how do you have a sense of that?
I'd say it was probably a couple of hours, so there wasn't a lot of wiggle room, really. It was close. It was definitely close because they didn't really know where they were. So it's yeah, it's hard to even think about if they had caught her, because that's exactly, she was the target. The the general was saying he was after her, but she just waited till the absolute last minute because she knew what it would look like to the American people of if she left, how bad that would be. So I think that's why she delayed so long, and then really didn't have a choice, that she needed to go. But she really didn't want to if she didn't have to.
Yeah, well, that right there shows our sense of history. I mean, knowing what this would mean, not only to the Americans living, in her contemporary times, but also what it would mean, moving forward as a nation that was still really, trying to establish itself.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, when you think about her, there's no roadmap at all about what to do, and she's kind of making it up as she goes along, like the Easter roll. That she's the one that started the Easter roll that we have today.
Okay.
So she started lots of traditions that we still have today.
Well, Libby, thank you so much for your presentation.
Oh, thank you very much.
We enjoyed it very much. I wanted to encourage our listeners to go to flare-net.org for more information about First Ladies Association for Education and Research. Please join us for our next month's presentation, and I hope you have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.